Hello, everyone. I'm Madeline Miller. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm the author of Circe, and I was really honored when Circe was chosen as a Barnes & Noble Book of the Month, and I'm really thrilled to be here. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about sort of who Circe is in mythology, read a short passage, and then I'll be taking your questions. So if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. I'll be hopefully reading them there, and also I think the Barnes & Noble media people will be putting them in. About sort of who Circe is. So, my first introduction to Circe came when I was about 15 years old. I absolutely fell in love with witch pigs. Now, if you know Greek mythology, you know that the female characters are often a little bit rough. If they're feeling really exciting, they might put die in it, but that's often about all they get. Usually the focus is on their husbands, their brothers, their sons, not on them. And so what I loved about Circe is here she is the daughter of a god, the daughter of the sun god Helios. She's also a witch, one of the first witches in literature. And she has this power that makes her sort of threatening to the gods. She has witchcraft and she can turn men into pigs. So the novel comes from towards the middle of the novel after there's a lot of feedback. Yes, I'm hearing the feedback too. I'm so sorry that you guys are hearing it. I don't know, I can't really change that on my end. I don't know if there's anything we can do about the feedback level. It was totally fine when I was in the green room, so I'm really sorry, everyone. Okay, I'm just waiting to see if maybe there's something that's going on. I'll try maybe turning down my microphone. Is it getting any better in terms of feedback? Hello, how's that? Is that better? Hooray, hooray. Okay, I'm gonna start over. Oh, good. Okay, everyone is saying it's better. A little page refresh. Okay. Is that, can everyone hear me? Okay. So I'm going to start by reading a little bit. The first passage I'm going to read comes from towards the middle of the novel, after Circe has already started turning men into pigs, which is what she is most famous for in Greek mythology. The he in this passage is the Greek hero Odysseus. He asked me once, why pigs? We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. So I'm going to start by reading in cowhide with silver inlaid in its carving. Towards the middle of the novel. Sometimes he would rub the silver absently beneath his thumb. Which is what she is most famous for in Greek mythology. The he in this passage. He gave me a bare smile. I mean it. I would like to know. I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the seeking out of things hidden. This was his highest worship. There were answers in me. I felt them, buried deep as last year's bulbs growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall, when my lions were gone, and my spells shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them, scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all. Their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. Come, I would say to them, it's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They are not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face. They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why I was drawn to writing about Circe. I talked a little bit about how excited I was when I was 13 years old. We were reading the Odyssey for the first time, and I learned that there was this amazing witch who turned men into pigs. And she really stood out to me because she wielded power, but she wasn't punished for it by the end of her story, which is usually what happens to women who wield power in Greek mythology. And so when we got to the Circe episode in the Odyssey, I was really on the edge of my seat. I thought, you know, Odysseus, he's smart and complicated. Circe, she's smart and complicated. They're going to have like a battle of wits. But what actually happens in the episode in the Odyssey is Circe turns Odysseus's men into pigs, and then he goes to confront her about it. And he draws his sword on her and threatens her. And she screams and falls to her knees and begs for mercy and invites him into her bed in basically one speech. And I just remember this incredibly profound feeling of disappointment, feeling like that's it, that's all she gets. You know, I understood this is Odysseus' story. He's the hero. She has to, you know, she's the obstacle he has to overcome. But I really just wanted the camera to stay on her a little bit longer. And, you know, I didn't know that seed, that reaction when I was 13 would eventually become this novel, but I do think that it was the beginning. Now, I ended up falling in love with Greek mythology and falling in love with Latin and eventually learning ancient Greek and loving the poetry even more. But I kept coming back to Circe as an older student in college and in graduate school. And what I realized is that later versions of Circe's story were actually much more negative than Homer's version. In Homer's version, she's the obstacle, she has to be overcome, but she isn't a villain. She actually ends up helping Odysseus. She becomes one of the most helpful characters that he encounters. She tells him how to get past the monsters. He has to face ahead. She allows him to rest on her island as long as he needs to. But in later versions of her story, she was just remembered as, you know, sort of this terrible man-hater, the seductress, the evil woman. And so part of what I wanted to do in writing this novel was to really, first of all, treat this character three-dimensionally. Make sure that this was, you know, the story of a real woman who was writing, you know, who's telling the story of her life. And I wanted to give her the full epic scope that heroes like Odysseus and Achilles have had for millennia. So I wanted her to, you know, face monsters and make mistakes and have to live with those mistakes. Because one of the things about ancient Greek heroes is when we use the word hero today, in the modern world, really we are talking about someone who's, you know, a moral hero. They're an exemplar. We're someone we would tell our children to look up to. But the ancient Greek heroes were really not like that. They were people with enormous strengths and also enormous weaknesses. Achilles, who's one of the greatest of the Greek heroes, the epic about him, the Iliad, begins, "Sing, goddess of the destructive rage of Achilles," which, you know, destroyed so many of his own people. So that's a very different kind of hero. And I liked the fact that the Greek heroes were often so messy. And I wanted to allow Circe to be messy too. I don't know if people are asking any questions, but if you have them, throw them up in the chat and I will try to answer them as they come by. The other thing that I really liked about Circe is that she was an artist. And that's really how I ended up interpreting her witchcraft. One of the things that draws me to these stories is even within, the gods and the monsters and the fate and the war, to me, these ancient myths are stories of people. So the Odyssey is really the story of this exhausted man who is desperate to get home to his family and who feels like he will never be home again. And so in looking at Circe's story, I saw this, yes, as a story of a goddess and a witch, and she fights monsters, and her father is the sun god. But at its core, this is the story of a woman finding her voice and finding her place in a world that is really hostile to her having a place. So I always wanted the emphasis to be on her humanity. And part of her finding her voice and finding her place is her discovering her art, and her art is witchcraft. One of the things that I really like about sort of witchcraft, and why I'm drawing a distinction between divinity and witchcraft, is that divinity is something you're born with. It's like, if you're a god, you have the Shazam type of power. You can think something and you make it happen. Whereas witchcraft comes out of work, it comes out of expertise, it comes out of trial and error, passion, knowledge. In other words, it's a craft, it's an art. So I also saw Circe as an artist from the beginning. I see a question about what is the next story I'm going to write. Is it Medusa? I get so many questions about Medusa. I love Medusa's story. It's such an interesting story. I think it's very interesting that so many of the monsters in Greek mythology are female. The sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, Medusa, Echidna. And there's so much to say about her, and she has, I would love to read 10 novels about her. So if any of you out there are thinking about writing Medusa novels, I completely empower you to start doing it, because I do think her story needs to be told. She is not necessarily on, I would love to write about her down the line, but she's not coming next for me. The things I'm working on right now are a novel that is inspired by the story of Pandora. Pandora is the figure from Greek mythology who is given a box by the gods. She's created as the perfect woman, and then she's given a box by the gods and told never to open it. She is curious, and so she does open it, and all the evils of the world fly out and infect mankind. So basically, it's an Eve story. It's a story of everything is the fault of a curious woman. And I think it's really interesting to kind of look at her story and imagine, her as a real person. I'm also really interested in theater. I have a background in theater, and I'm a Shakespeare director in particular. So the novel, I think the next novel I'm going to write, fingers crossed, is actually, I believe, going to be inspired by Shakespeare's Tempest, which is sort of a natural outgrowth of Circe in many ways, because it's also about magic and witches and islands. Okay. Someone is asking, what was my experience with language and studying classics? So the good news about Homer in particular, and the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Greek in general, is I think that it goes pretty well into English. And so I'm going to preface what I'm about to say by saying that if you read, for example, Emily Wilson's new translation of the Odyssey, I think you are getting a really powerful experience that brings you into the world of the Odyssey vividly and wholly. And, of course, whenever you are translating from one language to another, there has to be a change that happens, sort of a transformation. So, it's never one-to-one. But I think you can really get a really strong immersion in the stories by reading a really great translation. That said, when I started learning Greek, it was so thrilling for me, because I've always loved poetry, and the ancient poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were actually written originally as songs. The Iliad means the song of Troy. They were composed, they were sung, they were often accompanied by music. And so there is this deep rhythm and poetry to them. And I loved just falling into that poetry and feeling the rhythm of the language and really getting to enjoy it from that place. So for me, my love of the language and my love of the material are really linked. Now, one of the things that an old professor of mine used to say about classics, Latin and Greek, is that it keeps you humble, because however much you learn, there's always more to learn. And, you know, you think you've conquered Homer, but then you pick up Plato and you think, oh my gosh, I can't understand anything he's saying. And that is definitely true. Classics does keep you humble. And I appreciate that I am a lifelong student of classics. I'm just seeing if there are any questions that are popping up. Oh, what is my favorite book? And then I see a craft question. Oh, sorry, one popped up below. Okay, I'll answer that one first. I'll come back to my favorite book. So what was my thought process on portraying the men in Circe's story and her relationships with them? So one of the things that I was really interested in, I've always been interested in characters that are, you know, breaking the mold and trying to push away from society and sort of find their own path. And women who want to have independence in the ancient world really have to break away, because they're certainly not allowed it or given it within the structure of society. But of course, any society that is constricting 50% of its population, i.e. all the women, it's constricting way more than that. It's also going to be forcing men into roles that they don't necessarily want to take. So as I was looking at the male characters and thinking about them, I was also thinking about the ways that they were being forced to do things that perhaps they didn't want to do. And I always want all my characters to be really three-dimensional and to allow them to sort of live fully on the page in all their complexity. So one of the characters that I was really interested in was Odysseus's son, whose name is Telemachus. And I'm not going to give any spoilers here, but I will say that I think it would be very difficult to be the child of Odysseus. And that if you had a father who was best of the Greeks and known for being the wiliest of the Greeks and the smartest and the cleverest, and he fights monsters, that you might possibly want to choose a different path. I was also really drawn to the character of Daedalus. In mythology, he's the master craftsman who creates the labyrinth that holds the monster, the Minotaur. He's sort of like the genius inventor. He has so much, he's so miraculous in terms of how he can work with technology that it's basically like magic. And I saw Daedalus, he originally was just going to be a very small figure in the novel for me. But as I wrote, he just kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And I realized that he and Circe were actually just on opposite sides of the same line. Circe was the goddess who is almost human, and Daedalus was the human who has these powers that make him almost a god. And the two of them are both artists in their own way, and he sort of is the first artist she encounters. So she is very drawn to him from that sense. So I always want to be treating all my characters like they're full people, and looking at the ways that those, strictures are affecting men as well as women. Okay. What is my favorite book? Yes. I cannot possibly just pick one. I am a lifelong bookworm. I have read, I have so many favorites. So it's whatever I say, then I'm going to immediately tonight feel terrible that I left off all the others. But I will say I love growing up. One of the first novels that really knocked me off my feet was Watership Down, which it just goes to show how powerful the genre of epic is. It even works when your protagonists are bunnies. Watership Down is still a great story, and it's very steeped. Basically, it's the Iliad and the Odyssey with rabbits. So I really enjoyed that. I loved, growing up, I also loved Jane Eyre. I read that when I was maybe in 8th grade, and it just kind of blew my mind. I loved reading Tennessee Williams. I read a lot of plays when I was in high school. I loved The Handmaid's Tale. That was another favorite book. I always go back to Virgil's Aeneid. That is a favorite. Anything James Baldwin has ever written is also a favorite. So I cannot possibly pick one, but those are some. All right. What have I been Oh, when writing, do I prefer total silence or background noise? I need total silence. So I'm going to describe my writing process here. And I apologize because it makes me sound a little bit creepy. But I prefer to be in a darkened room with no sound. And ideally, I have a hood that I kind of pull over my head to, block out everything around me. I am a very visual writer, and I really need to be able to imagine the scene in front of me, imagine the characters, imagine the landscape, imagine the room, the clothes, the textures, the smells. And so I could never write in a cafe because then I'm being bombarded by stimulation. I sort of need to go almost in like a sensory deprivation chamber in order to really be able to imagine it. And I think some of that comes from my directing, that I imagine it almost as if I'm directing it and it's up on the stage in front of me. So yes, I cannot have music or noise at all. Was there a scene in Circe that was particularly fun to write? I think as a writer, I always have to be having some level of fun when I'm writing, even the hard scenes, even if I wouldn't describe it necessarily as fun, but I always have to be deeply engaged. If I'm not deeply engaged in a scene, I just can't write it. For instance, there was a story about Circe turning this guy into a woodpecker in the mythology that I didn't end up using because I kind of sat down to possibly approach writing about it. And I thought, I am just not engaged in this story. So every scene I have to be really engaged in. But I will say that one scene that I really enjoyed was the scene with Trigon. So I'm going to be a little bit vague about this because I know some people watching have read the book and some people have not. But I will say that in Greek mythology, there is a story that Circe arms her son with a stingray tail spear. And I remember just being obsessed with that detail and thinking, oh my gosh, what a perfect witchy weapon that is. But immediately my brain started spinning. It can't just be a regular old stingray tail. It has to be like this tail of the biggest stingray in the world, and she has to go down to the bottom of the ocean. So my brain immediately starts kind of chewing over this. This was before I had almost written a word of Circe, and I had no idea where that scene was going to fit, her getting this special stingray tail to make this spear for her son. But when I finally got to the moment where I was like, aha, this is where it goes. And I wrote that scene. I really enjoyed digging into it and sort of letting my imagination take flight. There are two other scenes that I would say were very memorable to write. One is all the scenes between Circe and Penelope, Odysseus's brilliant wife. Circe in Greek mythology and Penelope do meet, and I was really excited to imagine that meeting. These two very intelligent women, very complex, survivors, single mothers, artists who have, kind of lived this life of deprivation in many ways. In terms of loneliness, they've both been very lonely in their lives, and getting to put those two women in a room together and have them talk to each other was really an absolute thrill. And then the final one I'll add was, as a novelist, having the opportunity to write a Minotaur cesarean section scene is pretty much like a career peak. So I definitely had fun writing that scene. In mythology, Circe's sister really is the mother of the Minotaur. And so there was this natural in to that scene. I never wanted to be jamming Circe into mythology where she didn't belong, but obviously since she's the aunt of the Minotaur, it made sense for her to have interaction with that story. And my husband is always my first reader, so I gave him the scene after I had written it, and he read it and looked at me and said, "You really went for it, didn't you?" So yes, I did. I feel like if you're going to write a Minotaur C-section, you have to be turned up to 11, pretty much. Would I ever consider writing a YA novel? I possibly. I think right now my next two that I have in mind are adult novels. I did just write a children's book, so I never know. I sort of go where whatever the story that is gripping me. And yes, I usually say that kind of 13 and up is the general age, I would say, for my books. You know, I definitely have had parents who come and say, my daughter is 10 or my son is 10 and they love your book. But I think high school is good. I see a question on the side about how do I separate and decide which sources I'm going to use when I'm writing. Oh, and then I'll get to the magical herbs question. Thank you for that. But since I've started to answer this one, how do I choose what part of the myth I'm going to use? So I feel like I'm a little bit like a scavenger. I go through all the myths around the characters that I'm going to be writing about, and I just sort of pick up little pieces and I let them germinate and I kind of chew over them, and then I see which ones are starting to generate heat. The stingray tail spear, for instance, you know, immediately gripped me. Thinking about Circe turning men into pigs, one of the huge omissions of the original story of Circe turning men into pigs in the Odyssey is that there's never any context for it. No one says to her, hey, why are you turning men into pigs? It's just sort of treated as like, well, you know, who knows why, or maybe it's just because she's a woman, you know what they do. They're totally irrational, turn you into a pig. And so part of what I wanted to do is sort of, I was drawn to that myth because I wanted to understand why. Why that's a pretty extreme thing to do, turning someone into a pig. So why would you start to do that? And how would you get that kind of power? So I sort of let my own curiosity pull me into the story. Okay, why would someone behave that way? How would they behave that way? And my passion for the characters. So it's a little bit of a mysterious process to me, and I you know, sometimes I reject versions of the story and sometimes I take them, but it totally has to do with my own interest. If it's not interesting to me, then I can't possibly make it interesting to my reader. So what was my method when researching all the magical herbs and plants that Circe used? Thank you. So I have always loved physic gardens. I don't know if there are any gardeners out there, but physic gardens are oftentimes in botanical gardens, they'll have a little section where it's all the sort of medicinal herbs or herbs that were believed to be medicinal. And I would always gravitate to those anytime I was sort of in a garden that had one, and I would spend hours looking over them. So I didn't know that I was doing all this research for Circe before I was doing it, before I was actually writing, but I was very fortunate that I had this background of sort of herbs that had been used over time. All the herbs in the novel are somewhere in ancient mythology or ancient literature. Many of them come from medical manuals, or sometimes they come from myths. So they all have an actual, you know, place in the ancient world. Some of them really do the things that I say that they do. For example, yarrow really is a blood coagulant. Hellebore really is a poison. So I wanted to use things that, you know, actually had powers that the ancients believed. You know, willow bark is, you know, sort of related to aspirin. So it really is a painkiller. So I was looking at stuff that has a real effect, but I was also looking at things that the ancients believed, where they looked at a particular plant and believed it had a particular kind of power. So mostly I just kind of searched through what are all the herbs that are referenced in medicine, what are the ones that are talked about in food, what are the ones that are talked about in myth, and sort of, again, let all that process in my brain. We don't really have any actual sort of discussion, like really deep digging into spells from the ancient world. A lot of the sort of talk about witches in the ancient world is you know, either about curses or love potions. And it doesn't really get into the more herbal parts of it. But Circe is the word for herbs in Greek is pharmaca. It's where we get like pharmaceuticals, pharmacy. So it's interesting that medicine and herbcraft were definitely linked. But I love plants and I love doing that research. I see a question about, yes, did I do a lot of travel? I definitely did. And particularly for, well, really for both of them. I was so fortunate to get to go be part of an archaeological dig when I was in college. This is before I had started writing either Song of Achilles or Circe. And I spent a whole summer living in Greece, and I got to travel around a lot. And I didn't know that that would be a key to me writing these novels, but it definitely was. There is no substitution for being able to smell the air and walk in an olive grove and look at the way the sun hits the water. Those are the intangible things that you just have to sort of be there for it. For Circe's Island, the places of the Odyssey are very debated. Where are they? Are they here? Are they here? People have a lot of opinions and conjecturing about it. With Circe's Island, I believe it wasn't really a real place. But in the ancient world, they sort of put it in a couple different places. In Homer, Circe's Island is supposed to be near the dancing grounds of dawn, which means somewhere in the east, probably meaning the Black Sea, over, near Turkey. Later authors put her right near Rome. The Romans love to claim everything for themselves. So they're like, she was right here off of Rome. And so as I was thinking about Aiaia, I sort of, which is Circe's Island, I took kind of 25% Black Sea, 25% Greek island, 25% Amalfi Coast, and then 25% magic. And I kind of put all those together to imagine the island. But being able to go to those places, and I am aware how lucky I am that, my research is the Amalfi Coast. But it was really helpful to go to those places and really see them and be there. Is there one character in mythology that I absolutely despise? Oh, there sure is. I cannot stand Agamemnon. Drives me crazy. He was just the worst. He is the worst. And there are a lot of really bad characters in Greek mythology, but Agamemnon just really gets me. The gods in Greek mythology are usually so awful. They're selfish, they're cruel, they're completely, only interested in their own desires. They're capricious, they're vengeful. Basically, if we were going to diagnose them in a modern psychological context, we would call the Greek gods sociopathic narcissists. But Agamemnon and the humans are usually a little bit better. The humans seem to have the ability to, feel empathy and connect with each other and help each other in a way that mostly the gods don't feel at all. But Agamemnon, even though he's a human, he's as awful or more awful than a god. He's just so petty. So I have a lot of, I don't advocate murdering someone in a bathtub with an axe, which is what happens to Agamemnon at the hands of his wife Clytemnestra, but he did super deserve it. I would add, by the way, that talking about sort of the gods as sociopathic narcissists and humans as having much more empathy, I would say that part of what drew me to Circe is this description of her from the Odyssey, where she's described as the terrifying goddess who speaks like a human. And that idea of speaking like a human really worked on my imagination. And I thought, what that meant to me as a novelist was that Circe was capable, unlike most gods, of feeling empathy and of wanting to connect with humanity. And so that description of her from Homer, that she's this goddess who can speak like a human, ended up forming the architecture of the whole novel, actually. And I saw that sort of multiple times, is that was really her most important character trait, is her empathy. And I think it's humanity's, one of humanity's greatest virtues is our ability to reach out and help each other. I see a question, do I ever experience writer's block? And if so,